Good morning, Wabash. Good morning, Sam. Today, speaking in Pioneer Chapel will be Chief of Staff and Deputy Secretary of State for Indiana, Brandon Clifton, with his talk entitled Modern Elections in America, a Survey of Foreign Interference and Domestic Preparedness. A native of Lafayette, Brandon Clifton graduated from Wabash College, where he served as a team captain of the varsity football team. Brandon also attended law school at Barry University and earned an MBA in Orlando, Florida. He is currently an officer of the Indianapolis Association of Wabash Men's Board of Directors, a Penrod Society member, and an alumnus of the Indiana Leadership Forum. Clifton joined the Indiana Secretary of State in November of 2014 as Deputy Secretary and Chief of Staff. Brandon is responsible for administering the duties and responsibilities of the 61st Indiana Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, one of 5 constitutional office holders and the 3rd highest ranking official in state government. Brandon, his wife, and daughter reside in Broad Ripple with their 2 Labradors. So please give Mr. Brandon Clifton a Wabash welcome.
Good morning, Wabash College. Bear with me. I got to take a selfie for my mom. So, gentleman's rule, guys in the back, no middle fingers or anything like that. Thanks, fellas. Let me get my stopwatch up here. So, Sam, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you, Wabash College community, for having me. As Sam said, I serve as the Chief of Staff and the Deputy Secretary of State for Secretary of State Connie Lawson. She sends her regrets today, but she looks forward to maybe having the opportunity to speak to this group in the future, and certainly after the election in November. So today I'd like to speak to you a little bit about, am I projecting okay? Am I too close? You guys good in the back? Thanks. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what's happened over the last couple years in the election space. We've heard a lot of things are true, a lot of things aren't true, just a ton of content out there, very politicized. And I think what you'll gather from my comments, we're more divided probably today than we have ever been, and certainly in my life, and I think in the lives of many people here in the room. And I'll speak to a little bit about why that is the case, and we have a lot of work to do going forward. At times, I'll be transparent with you. I'll certainly speak through the vein of our and my official responsibilities, but we'll also relay the Secretary's positions and the state of Indiana's position based on our political foundations as well. It's really impossible to disconnect the two at times. Prior to doing so, I was asked to give just a little bit of historical perspective of my path for your benefit and for your understanding. So as Sam said, from Lafayette, went to college, of course here, went to grad school in Florida, worked for a law firm in Lafayette after graduating here from the college. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do at that time, but learned a lot working for the law firm up there, and then decided to go to law school and business school. Went out of state, down to Florida, and at that time, like I said, being from Lafayette, going to college here on campus, wanted to see someplace different, and I'm certainly glad that I did, because I wanted to return as quickly as possible to the place that makes sense and to the people, the kind people here in the state. So upon returning home, I networked for a few months over the summer, really tapped into that Wabash community. At times, I would have breakfast, lunch, and maybe a beer in one day, and maybe the same thing on the next day, maybe more, maybe less, just in an effort to learn from the path of those that came before me. I think you were probably one of those guys at the time. As I tell so many people, networking is not about getting a job. It's about putting yourself in a position so that when the opportunity arises, the person that you just met with will remember you, will remember your brand, will remember what you've done, and will give you a call when that opportunity arises. Do we have any career services staff member in the room? Here we go. Several of them. Guys, you got to spend as much time with career services as possible. Has everybody seen that Gatorade ad that, there's the 2 football players that eventually meet on the field. They're working out at the same time. They're doing push-ups at the same time. They're running sprints at the same time. They don't know that maybe their paths will collide at some point in the future, but they do. And it's about the preparation and what you're willing to invest and what you're willing to do in an effort to put yourself in a position to someday and at some point beat that person. The same is true with regard to your networking efforts and your relationships with career services. You have to practice, you have to prepare, because you're going to want something someday, and somebody out there is doing the very same thing. And so what are you investing now that is going to eventually beat that person that you don't know about? You maybe will never meet, but your paths will collide in a job interview or when an opportunity arises. So some guys, I'll just be honest with you, some guys will have great relationships and have great time invested with career services. I honestly wasn't one of those when I was here on campus and learned the value of career services afterwards. So when you walk out of this room and out of this chapel, make the decision to spend more time with career services. And let's be honest, guys, you either will decide to do it or you won't. And maybe you make no decision at all, but that's an implied choice and an informed choice that you're not going to do so. So I charge each and every one of you to invest more time with career services. It is worth the practice and the time to get what you want someday. Still working on that air conditioning here in the chapel, aren't we? Hugh, do you have any pull on that? Not yet? So, and all that networking, it really paid off for me, because I had eventually, after probably 50, 60, 70 meetings with folks around the summer, the reputation had gotten around that I was looking for a position as an attorney in state government, one to work on policy, one to work on legislation, and I was eventually hired by the wife of a Wabash graduate and what was also a fraternity brother that was several years older than I was at the time. And ironically, it's that same Wabash grad that recommended to the secretary that I succeed him when he was looking for a change in his profession as well. So it's a small world, and the Wabash community is very tight and very valuable. So let's talk a little bit about elections. Let me start with this. In 2016, no votes were changed here in Indiana or anywhere else around the country. Every single vote that was cast was counted as it should have been. And I'm not going to say some very nice things about the United States, the Federal Department of Homeland Security, but I want to make that known. I want to distinguish it because the Indiana Department of Homeland Security has been a tremendous value to the Secretary's office and to me and the performance of my responsibilities. So in August of 2016, we received word from the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, as I'll refer to it at times, that various foreign actors were attempting to influence and interfere with our elections. It was basically that. We couldn't do anything with that intelligence. We couldn't take any specific action. We couldn't scan our servers, scan our logs. We couldn't push information to the clerks. It was just, there are foreign governments that are attempting to interfere. What we know at the time is that when federal officials and DHS told us that there were foreign nations attempting to interfere in our elections, they knew that Arizona and Illinois had their statewide voter registration systems had been compromised to one degree or another by Russian actors. It wasn't until October of 2016 that the FBI issued an alert for us to scan several IP addresses in our database, in our statewide voter registration servers, and we scanned over 15 million logs of code to see if those IP addresses came back at all. Unfortunately, they did not. There were various federal and DHS reports prior to and after the election of 2016, none of which that resulted in actionable intelligence. That's a key term, actionable intelligence. And ironically, we started hearing more about what's critical infrastructure. DHS thinking about designating elections as critical infrastructure, and I'll detail those parameters here in a moment. So while we're receiving vague information, we're pushing back on the designation of elections as critical infrastructure, because when federal officials and agencies begin to talk about more jurisdiction over elections, let's bear in mind that those very election responsibilities belong to the states. Congress can mandate and can pass requirements on the time and manner of an election. Even worse, and I'm going to travel down the funnel in our poor relationship during 2016 and 2017, and I'll climb back up to where we are today, which is a positive state. But I want to tell the story. So at the same time, after the election in 2016, in November and into December, our Indiana Office of Technology alerted us that Department of Homeland Security IP addresses had been identified as having probed, attempted to penetrate, scanned the Secretary's public-facing registry, like Indiana voters, other division applications that we have and registries that we have. So after an internal investigation and external investigation, we approached DHS about their scanning, and their response to us, well, this is just in the ordinary course of business. However, we had never experienced or seen that type of scanning in the past. The problem is we know that other Secretary of States, and those that were most vocal against the critical infrastructure designation itself, were also scanned by DHS, and also scanned at very specific times in which those very officials were testifying before Congress. We can only assume that at the time, and this is under a different administration and different personnel I know that are no longer there, at the time, it appears that the federal agency was attempting to gather intelligence on its own states as to, and maybe provide that intelligence to members of Congress, other federal officials, other federal agencies about either the vulnerability or maybe the lack of vulnerability with regard to how we protect our election systems. As you might imagine, DHS was unsuccessful in compromising our registries, our systems. And I liken this behavior is exactly the same behavior that Arizona and Illinois experienced during their breaches. This is true life spy stuff, guys. I mean, this is scary stuff. When the government attempts to build cases against you, run counter to what your statewide elected officials have maintained as the best posture and position on behalf of Hoosiers or on behalf of Georgians or on behalf of Oklahoma Sooners, I guess is what they're called. And has truly and only solidified my everlasting suspicion of government motivation. And I fear that where we are today is the government is just too large to hold accountable sometimes. And we're certainly fortunate to have elections as a mechanism to hold government accountable. So in 2017, in January of 2017, just days before the change in administrations, former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson designated critical infrastructure over elections. This occurred over bipartisan calls against the designation because we're still fact gathering. We're still trying to figure out what this means. Does this mean the government is now responsible for registering voters? Does this mean the states have less jurisdiction? A lot of unanswered questions, but major consequences if the designation is not implemented correctly. So as you can imagine, in light of the unauthorized, and let me also add illegal scanning of DHS, illegal in terms of state law and federal law, we're not off to a good start with the agency. So what's critical infrastructure? There are 16 critical infrastructure sectors that whose assets, whose systems are so critical that they basically run through the very fabric of our country. Other sectors include energy, communications, and defense, to name a few. But elections was a new beast for the agency because that's governed by elected officials, elected political officials, very vocal officials. So bear with me as I cool down for a moment once more. And the feds say this designation is offered as necessary so that they can prioritize their own resources in response to various emergencies. And one of the main points the Secretary of State made was, well, these very resources are available now and without the critical infrastructure designation. But literally it takes an act of the President and an act of Congress for a federal agency to really respond to threats like we experienced with Russia. And I can assure you folks that in Indiana, if there's an emergency, regardless of the requisite authorities in place, we will be responding at both the Secretary's office and the Governor's office and throughout the state. So a few months later, the Secretary and I, we met with the Vice President's intelligence and military policy teams to explain our experiences through the designation, the rush to judgment, the rush to really pass this and issue this designation before the change in administration. And we advocated on behalf of the repeal of the designation, but at the same time, you can imagine the political ownership that would be at stake if any administration rolled back a critical infrastructure designation, and at the end of the day, there was a threat that was posed or an emergency that was required where that designation might have been helpful. So through the spring of 2017, there's, again, a lot of toxicity between the Secretaries of State and DHS, and at that time, Secretary Lawson had been elected as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, so she's responsible for advocating on behalf of all secretaries around the country. And then the summer of 2017, some of you might remember this, might be familiar, a DHS official publicly said before Senate Intelligence, the same Senate Intelligence meeting, the Secretary was testifying herself, Secretary Lawson, I mean, was testifying herself, and DHS said publicly that 21 states had been targeted by Russia in 2016, 21 states. So you can imagine when the secretaries learn that they may be or may not be one of the 21 through the media, as opposed to through the channels by which the critical infrastructure designation was established to provide, again, we are not at a good point. So, but this created an opportunity for the secretaries, because this was really the lowest point in our relationship and the lowest point that DHS, I think self-admittedly, the type of behavior that they engaged in. So after that, I spent some time in Los Angeles, in DC, and Atlanta, developing the policy by which and the charter documents by which the critical infrastructure designation would be administered. I want to make sure I'm on time, guys. So a year after November 16, the Secretary and I received our first classified briefing of Russian activity. And I can tell you that everything that you've heard in the news is true. Arizona, Illinois, the two states who had their statewide voter registration systems compromised. But more than anything, and is also available now, Russia engaged in a campaign of influence. They created fake news. They created fake social media accounts that looked like journalists. They used bots to push the traffic on those stories in an effort to boost the place in which that story appeared on Facebook or on Twitter or on Google. And so, and then just regular voters and consumers just took that information, they shared it with their friends, they pushed it around, and a lot of it, most of it, really every bit of it that was Russian, behind Russian propaganda was fake news. So that's real, and I think that's been real long before Trump. There's fake news out there. Everything's now so readily available to us online. It's just very easy to post a story and not have any real accountability associated with it. So let's go back to Illinois and Arizona. Voter registrations are compromised. What does that mean? Well, in Arizona, I think a little bit of data was exported to a server in St. Petersburg, Russia. And in Illinois, it was the download of data itself, a large volume of voter registration data that really flagged that there was something wrong. It was so abnormal. But for Russia to be successful, we have to understand it's not just the download and the exportation of voter registration data in a state's voter registration database. You have to modify it or delete it, and if you modify it, you have to put it back, all without being detected. And what that means is if you're registered to vote at 123 Main Street and you show up at the precinct and then your registration doesn't reflect that address, you could potentially be disenfranchised. You may be turned away at the polls since you are not registered at that address. The problem is voters here and around the country can vote provisionally. So that means you cast a ballot, conditional ballot in essence, which will be later reviewed when you provide evidence that you are who you say you are and your address is what it is. So even if Russia was successful in pulling voter registration out and putting it back, at the polls, we would have quickly determined that there was a problem. So how was Russia successful in these two states? Guys, it's phishing emails. Phishing emails are the gateway to hell when it comes to IT and technology. They are the gateway to compromising your servers, your offices, your political credibility, you name it. It is a small crack in the door that opens a gaping wound. So in Arizona, a rural county employee clicked an email from a Russian phisher, and then by way of various technologies and tools and applications that are just fascinating, they were able to control that computer, either wait for that employee to hit those keystrokes on the username and password into their statewide voter registration systems, or hop from their computer to another computer that maybe has better and more administrative rights in that system. So let me give you an example, a really fascinating example. A couple years ago, Russia wanted to shut down the energy grid in a foreign country. And imagine a bullseye with rings around it. And Russia has a lot of time. Foreign actors have a lot of time. This isn't just about Russia. It's about Iran. It's about China. It's about North Korea. It's about you name it. Domestic actors, foreign actors, private actors. There are companies out there, foreign companies, where people get up, go to work, and their job is to compromise your data, my data, your office's data, so they can sell it on the dark web. So imagine a bullseye. And the bullseye is the energy grid controls. Russia sent thousands of phishing emails to government contractors, other government offices, individuals. All they need is one person to click on that phishing email. And then maybe they can control your computer. And if they can control your computer, maybe they can send an email that looks official and is official from you, but with a payload that is another doorway to control that person's computer, or maybe hop into that server, or maybe compromise their email account or their user credentials, so on and so forth. So over the course of time, Russia was able to get a little bit closer to the bullseye by way of sending phishing emails to back and forth to vendors, to government employees, to government offices, you name it. Up until the point where a power company worker came in one day. And everyone here familiar with screen sharing? You got a problem with Apple, you call them up, you give them control of your computer, and you can see the mouse moving around. Employee walks in, opens up his computer. He sees the main control systems on his computer, and a mouse is moving around. This mouse was basically moving around and looked confused, and was only one click away from really turning off the entire country's power grid. But the problem the thinking is that Russian actors couldn't read the language that the computer was in. So they were never quite successful in turning off everything that they wanted to turn off. It's incredible, guys. Just one phishing email can lead to catastrophic results if we don't train on it, if we don't educate on it, if we don't change the culture of cybersecurity, which is exactly what we're doing in the election space. We have sent phishing emails to our staff, training to our staff, training to the counties, training to our vendors, because it's not just the Secretary of State's office that presents a vulnerability. It's everyone connected, and then 2, 3, 4 degrees disconnected from the election community that potentially presents a risk to our elections. So another point I want to make, let me actually move forward a little bit. Let me say quickly, all those data breaches, LinkedIn data breach, your username and password was leaked, Target breach, Facebook breach. You hear it on the news and you never hear about it again. What happens is these actors buy and sell that information on the dark web because they know that we have a habit of using our same username and password across our Macy's accounts, our Nordstrom accounts, our work accounts, and if it's not the same, sometimes it's a derivative. Instead of B. Clifton 123, it's 1234 or 1234, so on and so forth. So we have implemented some very rigid and some of the most robust passphrase, password requirements. And I offer that not only for your understanding of Indiana elections, I tell you this for your own security as well, because this stuff is not going anywhere. Long gone are the days of a Nigerian prince who has $100 million for you if you just send him $1,000. These guys are getting good, They are using social engineering to research the people around you so that the likelihood of you clicking on that email is greater than if they just sent, I'm a Nigerian prince kind of an email. These emails are fascinating. They look like they're official. So I'll end on a couple of points. One is, I've talked about statewide voter registration systems and the known threats that happened and the compromises that happened in Arizona and in Illinois. But Congress is paying particular attention to what's called direct record electronic equipment. Indiana uses two types. It's an OpScan, it's your Scantron, a ballot, or it's a touchscreen. And Congress has been concerned, even though they're the very ones that suggested that we go electronic after the hanging Chad incidents in 2000, Bush v. Gore, those very same voices want us to go back to paper. It's what's called the voter verifiable paper trail. Because if I'm using a touchscreen to vote, I'm not actually verifying the paper record. Even though there is a paper record, it's internal to the machine, but the voter is not verifying that record. So just on Tuesday, the Secretary and I saw a demonstration of equipment that keeps the convenience of a DRE, which people like, legislators like. There has been no threat ever provided to me or the Secretary or any members, administrators in the election space that this equipment is vulnerable or has been compromised, I should say. We know about voter registration. We have not heard of a single hard case about electronic voting equipment. That said, voter verifiable paper trail is the insurance policy. We can audit those records. We can examine those records. Those can't be tampered with. If I make my selections electronically and then I look at the paper receipt or the paper ballot, and then it's later used for audit purposes. So just providing an additional layer of insurance there. Just got a couple minutes left. We've implemented two-factor authentication. Guys, if you're not using two-factor authentication in your own personal capacities, you got to start using it. It's the FBI said it's the number one thing we could do to prevent the Illinois and the Arizona cases. And we've even taken it a step farther. It's two-factor authentication. It's something that you know, something that you're going to get offline, and something that you got to have. You got to have a USB token kind of a thing that is a key almost and plugs into your computer so it authorizes your specific computer to do whatever it's authorized to do. We've implemented Albert sensors. Those are sensors that allow us to share intelligence across states with regard to, I saw another demonstration, red, green, and blue, a red IP address coming from China over to some state, some county that's known to be suspected of various attempts to compromise equipment. So we have these sensors installed in an effort to identify that activity before and while it is hitting our systems. And then we can share that intelligence as well across the country. So I guess there's so much more, and I want to end on time for you guys. I want to transition to the call. I want to make a call for you guys. So for those of you that are volunteering on campaigns now or may in the future, please take a look at our website because we have a lot of cyber training tools and skills available for any member of the public to learn how to better protect themselves against the threat that is real. And at the end of the day, I think the critical infrastructure designation was appropriate. I think it was awful in the handling of it and still very toxic between the states and the government. But at the end of the day, the sharing of intelligence has been incredibly valuable for us. So let me say that Russia was successful in compromising our confidence in elections. And you have every reason to believe that your state and your country is doing everything it can to protect your elections and making the investments in the future to ensure that however way, shape, or form you vote, whatever political party you're from, your vote is counted fairly and consistently and can be audited after the fact. So please get involved. It's important to get involved in your political community and volunteer your time. I don't care what party you're from. I mean, the Secretary has a Pirate Party candidate this year. It's a write-in candidate. If that's your thing, go for it. But give your time. Be willing to make calls, knock on doors. It's hard work, but your community involvement here should continue when you leave this place and when you go home over the summers or after you graduate. If it's serving in your local community organizations, if it's volunteering on behalf of campaigns, there is a tremendous opportunity for young people to make contributions because it's just not common. And so I have often tried to be a contrarian. I think a lot of guys here are contrarians and go where people are coming from. And so when you, as I'm telling you that young people just are not involved as much as they could or should be in campaigns and in the political sphere, I'm telling you there's an opportunity to be had, and your time would be greatly appreciated. So please consider volunteering. We need you now more than ever. I hope this update's been valuable. It's certainly been a fascinating experience for me. When I walked into the job, it was about InBiz, our business one-stop project, and now it's all changed to cybersecurity and defeating the Russians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, and we have all the resources we need, and we're looking forward to getting more in the future. So thanks for having me. I appreciate your time.